Hello again, BookTube, and welcome to a very quick review, or what will hopefully be, at least by my standards, a very quick review of Gerald Murnane's The Plains. It's this little book here. Even though I did say in the channel sort of Q&A, the introductory video, that I wouldn't be uploading that consistently, I still feel a little bit bad that it has actually been about a month and a half since I did last post, because I have actually been meaning to record this for a little while. Because I absolutely adore this book. It's probably, I'd say it is my favorite. It always sort of shifts, like your favorite novel, your favorite film, but right now this is my favorite novel. That being said, I'm not that well read when it comes to novels. I'm much better read when it comes to short stories and poems, but even then, I'm not amazingly well read or anything. But ever since a friend recommended Murnane to me, and I checked out this book during actually the mid-semester break of a university semester back in 2023, I read this in 2 days. I'm a very slow reader. I just completely just breezed through this. It was just just in one of those lovely perfect reading experiences. I shall be discussing some themes, and I think themes that, particularly themes that I feel that some other reviews on YouTube haven't actually really touched on or gone into as much as I feel they potentially could have. Not to create beef with any of the channels who featured The Plains, because there's lots of really good reviews of it out there. I'm not saying that they were shoddy reviews or anything like that. I should also just quickly say here, actually, just to provide a very quick sort of explanation, is that the best way to summarize the novel is simply that you have a narrator who is unnamed, but he's from Australia, and he's a documentarian, and he goes out to this strange imaginary place called the Plains, which are just there are actual just areas of plains within the interior of Australia. But this is sort of this strange landscape where you have all these wealthy people called the plainsmen, who are these sort of wealthy landowners, and who actually sponsor artists who go out to seek their sort of patronage and their support, and to operate in this area. So essentially it's just the narrator who goes out there. He gets marooned there for 20 years, and he just tries to make a film about the land, basically. So it doesn't sound too riveting based on that, but it's the way that Murnane... It's the humor, it's the beauty of the language that really make it captivating. So I'm going to be going through basically just a numbered list of reasons you should read this book, and what the strengths are, what I think the real strengths of it are. In fact, I've even actually printed out my Goodreads ramble, just to keep myself a little bit focused during this. Anyway, on to the review. So reason number one why you should read this novel. I feel, by the way, that everyone should read this book. That's very presumptuous, but I do think, though, that it is just, for me, it's maybe a cliche, but for me, the entire universe is pretty much contained within this text. It is centered around a male narrator, yes. It is set in an extremely pretty much a retrograde patriarchal society, a very elitist patriarchal society as well. So not only do you have the element of the patriarchy, but you also have immense wealth and privilege occurring. But nevertheless, I do think that the themes it circles, and the sort of moods and emotional states that it cycles through and that it sort of explores seem to be unmapped by a lot of other literature and a lot of other art. And I also think the depth to which it delves I think it sort of goes beyond. It almost transcends its protagonist's gender. It almost transcends the context from which these ideas are emerging. But especially I do think this is a must read if you are Australian, because I do, as I'll go into later, I think it does something really, really unique that I haven't seen much other Australian literature do. So anyway, reason number one, I feel like you should read this book because, at least for me, it redefined what a novel could really do. That again is a broad statement, but what I mean is that it was pretty much the first novel I've read where it feels like it's been completely freed from the constraints, and sometimes even the tyranny of narrative, and storytelling and traditional characterization. You do get excellent characterization in this. I mean, you really, really feel completely submerged in the narrational viewpoint and the psyche. But nevertheless, this is a book that from the outset, just from the get-go, the first sentence is signaling that, traditional literary pleasures are not going to be, when I say traditional literary pleasures, I mean the ones around narrative, traditional entertainment of narrative, characterization, character arcs, setups, payoffs, they're not going to be an element of this book. So what I think it really is doing is it's sort of retraining it's retraining or it's broadening a reader's sort of horizons, I suppose, which is one of the key symbols in the book of horizons. And it just does that in a really, really sort of sophisticated way. Not just, telling you about these things, but it's how the form, it drops these elements, and that it actually, if you really stay with it, all the elements, but particularly the narration and the prose, will sort of reveal these qualities. I'll actually just read, because I think it's got probably one of the rare perfect opening paragraphs, although the entire book is spectacular. But I should read the opening just because because it will just be easier to explain what I mean. And it's kind of weird because I feel like I should issue a spoiler alert, but the thing is, this is the first page. So if you would just picked it up in a bookshop or something, or in a library, then this is what you would encounter. So I'm not going to say this as a spoiler alert. The opening is: 20 years ago, when I first arrived on the plains, I kept my eyes open. I looked for anything in the landscape that seemed to hint at some elaborate meaning behind appearances. So that's just, to me, perfect. It's setting up the central conceit, not the central conceit, but it's setting up the central concern, rather, which is to do with perception. And it's also setting up that narrative is being abandoned. We already know that the narrator is going to be marooned in this strange location of the plains for 20 years. So it actually from the outset makes the text feel very eerie. Not quite a horror work, but sort of this. I've seen a few critics actually compare this to Kafka, and I think that's quite accurate from the Kafka I've read. Both because it sort of is, it's preoccupied with preoccupation, or it's fixated on fixation, which I do think Kafka does in Kafka's short stories, at least. That seems to be a motif, and also that sort of eeriness where you're not actually sure exactly. There's not a clear rule, for the world. The opening also, in a way, sort of sets up a really interesting thing going on with the sort of diegetic framework, or the sort of narrational framework that Murnane is employing here. Murnane himself actually refers to it as true fiction, which I still think it's stunning he hasn't won the Nobel yet, because I can't really think of too many other people who are really even not even just achieving this, but who have even really attempted this. From my best attempt at summarizing it is that, true fiction is that it's neither fiction nor non-fiction, but it's really about the fiction that is actually directly from the mind of the writer. So when you read The Plains, of course, the narrative is, it could be read as literal, that there is this imaginary place, in the, towards the centre of Australia. But at the same time, this simply could just be Murnane and sort of Murnane adopting a sort of a persona, or sort of an alternative narrator, through which he can sort of express his his musings on reality and perception, but also his concerns and his doubts around his success, commercially, but also just even artistically at a fundamental level. So I just can't really think of too many other works. You do have I heard I didn't hear, but I read I think it's on one of the blurbs of one of the Murnane books, is that Teju Cole, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, compares him to Beckett, and I think that's a very apt comparison. I do think Beckett sometimes is also doing a sort of similar thing, where actually I had a brilliant quote from a university professor once. He said that with Beckett you have the narrator being narrated, and I think that's a really nice summary. If you want a novel that's really going to sort of redefine what can occur once you're sort of freed from these constraints of traditional characterization, traditional narration, and how there is actually so many other exciting elements and qualities to a text that we often overlook, then I can't recommend it enough. So yes, now on to point two. So point two is just simply, if you just want to read exquisite prose, if you just live for prose, then I cannot recommend this enough, because basically, as I said, we moved away from narrative, so what we really have now is prose. So what I really love is that, the prose is, I feel, quite unique, because it does, it has this sort of French philosophical quality to it, but the way it's so stripped down, and very dry and minimalist does also, to me, evoke some of the writings of, Eastern philosophers and Eastern poetry. But then at the same time, you also have this postmodern angle coming in. But I love the way that what Murnane does with his prose is that it is sort of postmodern. It is self-aware. It's commenting in a way on itself, but it doesn't have that sort of ironic tone to it. It is playful. But it has this it's this beautiful fusion of modernism and postmodernism. I think in an interview I saw with Murnane, or rather I read with, I think I did actually see it. I don't think it was one in text. That basically Murnane said that, he's not actually all that aware of postmodernism. I think he's just sort of come to this intuitively, that this is just simply, this is the best way that he can express his own outlook, rather than sort of an attempt to lock in and, appropriate or utilize a sort of pre-existing literary framework. What I also think is marvelous with the prose is how it sort of hypnotizes you. It manages to put you into this obsessive mindset, and this one of just doubts, then moments of confidence, but also but just constant doubts that the unnamed narrator experiences. You'll have these these movements across paragraphs where you're moving towards a conclusion, you're moving towards some sort of resonance, but then it will just be cancelled. Either he'll then go onto a new tangent, or he'll say, oh no, that's silly, or I couldn't do that, or that would be wrong. So it's this really it's this fantastic just demonstration of content and form just sort of dancing together. Lastly, with the prose, it's quite amazing, I think, the way that through these very simple sentences Murnane can just embed or implant these images into your mind as a reader. I mean, I'm still very haunted by this beautiful image where, and other critics have mentioned this, or other reviewers have mentioned this, where you have the narrator looking down at this sort of this female figure he's somewhat besotted with, this distant female figure. He's standing in one of the mansions that the plainsmen own, and that they've constructed on this very flat landscape. And he's looking down and he's wondering, as she turns around, did she see me? And then later on, when she's moved away, he he descends from the second story, or whatever story he was standing on, and then he actually assumes her situation, her position, and looks up at the window, and then realizes that she couldn't have seen him at all, because it was simply the window simply contained and reflected the sky, and I believe clouds as well, which is just absolutely gorgeous. And it's that thing I was saying, where it's this postmodern sort of thing of deconstruction. It's looking at, it's aware of its own sort of sense of perception, this motif of windows, gazing, and barriers, in different viewpoint, between different viewpoints. But there's this poignancy to it that I don't think a lot of postmodern texts can achieve, that it's very earnest, that there is often this pain of feeling like that you might be observing the world, but it may not be observing you back. Just to paraphrase that beautiful line in Chittick, Tichborne's elegy poem. I think it's, I saw the world, but the world did not see me, or something to that effect. I should say as well, in this point around the prose, what makes it really interesting is that you'll often have contradictions within the statements or the sentiments or the actions of the narrator, or even some of the other figures that he encounters. And so it almost reminded me of some French philosophical texts sometimes, where I'm thinking sometimes of Bataille, where it's not actually about the direct statements, but it's more about the interplay between the statements where the true meanings emerge. So it does also retrain, I think, your mind just not to be receptive and, if not a little bit passive sometimes with how it reads, but to become a lot more active, to become an active participant within the narrator's thoughts, to really, really interrogate their qualities, and just to become far more active. And I found it was just quite groundbreaking for me when I first read it. So, point 3. I maybe should have made this as the first point, but nevertheless, it's point 3 here, which is fascinating themes around art and identity. It's probably the best way I could summarize the themes going on in this book, and why I think it's very universal. And not just identity, but really how identity is accessed and conceived by our own perception, which I think is what makes it so universal. I don't, it's a book that, just going back to almost point 1, that made me realize that, well, really, what is the point in literature if you aren't directly engaging and constantly engaging with perception? The perception of the writer themselves, the perceptions of the characters, and even the perception of the framework of the novel, these sort of inherited perceptive qualities that, how a novel is organized, or, the sort of style can also have its own sort of perception and orienting it can possess this sort of orienting force around the events and the characters, and also the characterizations. So I think just what makes it, but I think the way, of course, art, identity, perception, not exactly completely new, but I think it's the degree to which it is able to explore these, just by simply putting aside narrative and everything like that. We really feel we feel marooned with the narrator, we feel obsessed like him, trying to look for some sort of conclusion, just so it feels like that, that his time spent sort of philosophizing and thinking and trying to make this artwork is actually being time well spent. I think it's just such a universal desire, for reality and meaning to be elucidated in a neat way, just to be distilled, so then we can sort of access it again, remind ourselves what's the sort of essence of reality. And I also think as well, it's this other universal thing of, all we simply want is for meaning to be achieved and communicated and neatly accessed, which often is a chimerical search, but nevertheless, it's such an essential one. I do think that this central symbol of the plains, this vast, flat stretch of land, just has to be one of the most ingenious central symbols or extended metaphors in literature. I think, to me, that the plains, that's kind of it does sort of perfectly summarize so much of existence. That even if we are on a very sort of sheer mountain, that nevertheless we do sort of feel like we don't have a great sense of the horizon, a proper sort of purchase on the landscape, or a proper comprehension of the topography of where we are. So I just think it's absolutely ingenious. And there was this great observation as well on a Goodreads review I saw, which was actually just how, that there's this part in the book where he does see a little hill, and that it's this hill suddenly becomes, it offers this amazing illumination and enlightenment almost, just by providing a little bit of verticality. And just providing a slightly higher outlook than the houses do, or, these flat lands do, which I just think is, again, that's almost a lovely little sort of microcosmic, is that a word? I don't know, microcosmic moment, that sort of summarizes the whole book, that, we have traditional, expectations, traditional pleasures stripped away, and that suddenly even the smallest things become, suddenly the smallest things take on this grand significance. I also just on this idea of art, though, I think that what's really, really fascinating with this book, and I can't think of another book that has really made me think this way, and this was I've never even thought of this, is really, the book seems to suggest, through this narrator failing constantly to really make his documentary, this film, and part of it is, of course, that he is slightly just procrastinating. Maybe he doesn't fully know about the form, but also part of it is, I think, as well, it's almost suggesting formally, because he does come to some really interesting conclusions that luckily we see either through his notes that he's left, or just by being able to listen into his own sort of stream of consciousness, is thought itself actually a form of art? Because, of course, thinking, what we think, does produce it helps to shape our identity, and our identities then go forward into reality. People witness us as people. And of course, they don't always glimpse the entire person. That's extremely difficult to do. But, it is still, in a way, sort of artistic. So I just thought it was absolutely fascinating in that way. And then it also seems to suggest, by pairing art next to history and physics, that, are also those sort of artful in their own way as well. Of course, they're very objective. Well, history not so much, but to a degree. But physics, of course, is very objective, even if there is, of course, contention within theories. But are they also sort of artful in their own way? Are they sort of always suffused with the personal viewpoint? Are they sort of suffused with the personal viewpoints of their agents? The scientists, to some extent, and also just, by being sort of these processes that people undertake, and, by creating these finalized, actually, I don't want to say products, that's a very cold and nasty word, but these sort of finalized works, is that almost in a way sort of artistic, or is perhaps art in a way then scientific, or a little bit more calculated? It's very, very interesting. Okay, so point 4, which I do think is another real strength of the work, is that it is a very self-reflective book, but it is also very humorous in a dry way. Again, I think, which makes Kafka, the Kafka comparison very apt, this sort of very dry and quite absurdist humor in some ways, that almost isn't actually so much funny in the moment as it is funny upon reflection, because you're so immersed in these very quirky, these quirky settings, or these, these sort of strange and alien, these strange and alien landscapes, where the rules of them aren't entirely clear. So you do have this wonderful humor, but what I also love is that it's a book about reflection that is very aware, it's self-aware around its own sort of risk of being, just navel gazing, and its own insularity, that, which I do think that sometimes some works, perhaps, particularly these philosophical novels, perhaps could sometimes, do with, just because, of course, I'm not, of course I don't need everything to be flippant. I don't want it to be flippant. But nevertheless, I do think that sometimes it's refreshing to find works where they do realize, actually, this is extremely selfish what the narrator's doing. They're just living in this in the middle of nowhere, and they're not really accomplishing all that much externally. And I also think there's this wonderful, if that isn't made clear, just through the narrator's own, just through his, these pages and pages of obsessions and thoughts, that you also have these amazing little moments of satire where, it's not directly stated too much, but when we actually see these plainsmen, who seem to claim, they claim, oh, we want to understand the landscape, and some of them have different goals and so forth, these wealthy landowners, is that they're essentially just, very sexist losers, because, you have a scene where, some of them are passed out drunk, having, they've just, they've basically just gorged themselves on food, and they've just imbibed, drink all night. I think the sun rises before they even see it. Which so it's this really wonderful sort of self-aware satire of so much art sometimes, that people don't actually go out and actually see the landscape. They often end up writing about it more than they're actually engaging with it. So that's just a really, really, I feel, refreshing quality. And actually, a friend of mine really brought up the wonderful point about how, when he read the novel, that it's also sharing this great insight about how, if you're an artist, that sometimes you can become too caught up in audience expectations, because, of course, by the end, basically, our narrator is so obsessed, and he's reliant on the patronage of these wealthy landowners, that is it really his film after a while, or is it just what he wants, is it just what he thinks they want to see, just that will make them happy? And that sort of made me realize, oh well, then this is actually one of the most brilliant satires on art, just making art as a whole, where unfortunately artists do often have to resort, unless they're born, with privilege, they often have to resort to, systems of patronage, and often working with often clueless people, or very, or people who are at odds with their own sort of values. And that they often do have to sometimes water down their own visions, and there is always this horrible, horrible tension or risk that artists sometimes have to deal with. So again, just a lovely and refreshing quality to this novel. So finally, point five. Point five is just this idea which I alluded to at the beginning, which is that for Australian readers, I think this is like one of the quintessential Australian texts. Not because it's really ochre, Aussie or whatever, or that it's getting to the, that it's exploring lots of different locations within Australia. But I think it's one of the few Australian texts to really answer the question. This could also be universal, or could be rephrased in a universal way. But it's one of the few, I think, that it really asks this question and does try and answer. How do we find belonging on such a vast continent? Australia is absolutely massive, and it is, you have these large areas which are often unpopulated. And so it is difficult to really get a sense of the entire continent. What does it mean for the person, for the individual person? What does it mean for you as an Australian, and so forth? And of course, you have lots of books that look at the idea of nationhood. Lots of Australian works, they look at nationhood and so forth. But I don't think there's many works that really look at the existential, the existential dimensions of that question. That if you can't actually, if you sort of feel overwhelmed by land, how do you find belonging on it? So, of course, I do think that there are, I do think, of course, that there are other Australian artists who have answered this and posed such questions and done it absolutely wonderfully. And I think on an equal level, in terms of mastery, I think immediately people who come to mind would be Tracy Moffat, who I think is just one of the most brilliant artists working today. And although she is acclaimed in Australia, it's a shame I don't think that she's more acclaimed internationally, and that she hasn't been able to make more films, because she's also just a masterful director. And I also think then, I've also just written down here, because I'm going to, it sort of seems disingenuous when I'm reading two of these artists, but just because I can go on rambles, and I'll be kicking myself when I'm editing the video, saying, why didn't I mention this person or whatever? But of course, Sidney Nolan and Arthur Boyd, I think, are also others who look at these existential qualities to the Australian landscape, and being positioned and born into such a vast landscape. And from what I understand as well, Patrick White also did that as well, though I haven't actually read any White outside of the odd extract, so it's not really, I can't really comment there. So yes, I think basically what it does is that it actually reconceptualizes Australia's nationhood as one that's actually deeply abstract, and not at all stable. It's actually quite elusive, and so perhaps the idea of is, rather than seeking a stable sort of nation, it's actually much more about perhaps to be Australian, or to really be anywhere within a nation, is actually just the idea. What defines everyone is this: that we are all defined by a longing to belong, but also that we are always searching for meaning. We are always searching for this sort of collective definition. So it's really, so I just think that's extremely unique. I do have a note here as well, which I do think is important. And I do think it is a valid objection that some people could raise, which is, Murnane doesn't really, he only alludes to, he doesn't really bring up, of course, Indigenous art, the Indigenous history, 60,000 years of history, which I don't think a lot of people realise just how long they have inhabited, this continent, this land. And so I can see some people I can see some people objecting to that. I almost said objectifying. I can see some people objecting to that. But I guess what I would say is that the satirical edges to the text sort of, they sort of mitigate it. Only because this is an insular place. This is and I haven't mentioned actually, but I should have mentioned back in the satire section that this is a patriarchal society. Women are voiceless. They're always in the background. They're very much objectified as these sort of idealized figures. These sort of angelic figures almost. Just wandering the horizons, wandering the land. And so forth. So yeah, I do think that these satirical edges, and also that there's clear contradictions within the plainsman's goals and the lifestyle, and also the goals of many of the artists and their own lifestyles. They sort of do, I think, answer to that objection, saying that, well, that this is not a book that's pretending to be, complete, summarizing the entirety of Australia. I also think as well that what I would also say though is that it is a very progressive text in the sense that it actually, it is abandoning, if not outright repudiating, many modes of traditional Western storytelling. So, traditional character arcs, traditional narrative arcs, and so forth. And, I do think what's funny is that oftentimes when you get, sort of, let's say, quote unquote, more like politically charged or progressive texts in the modern days, they're actually extremely conservative with how they forward their content. Of course, I understand sometimes if someone's just trying to make a point, they want to try and make it as accessible as possible. But it is interesting, how often you'll see these very politically charged texts that are trying to be very subversive and, progressive, but they end up just replicating, narrative, replicating and being fixated on narrative pleasures, and sort of spectacle around narrative and spectacle around character dynamics and so forth, and very traditional plot arcs and so forth. So it's or plot structures. So I think, again, I would just say it is overall a very progressive text. So, in summary, I think that this is just, I have the Text Classics edition. Actually, I do wish I could find a hardcover copy of the American edition, which I think it might have like a Ben Lerner penned introduction to it, only because it just look a bit cheap, the Text Classics one, I have to admit. Not so much, it's just clearly a stock image of wheat, which isn't so bad, but you've got this really like this camera which is kind of completely inappropriate because it's like a digital camera, I'm almost certain, on the front, and that's just completely inappropriate. He's using an analog camera, not digital, in the text, and it is a little bit bland, but the American one's a lot better because it sort of has these lines which are very fitting, because there is this central image of the horizon lines and looking into them, trying to almost just almost on the verge of meaning. But yeah, I do think this is an absolutely fabulous, but yeah, I do think this is just a must read, and if you have read it, or if you do check it out after watching this video, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Just do you agree with some of my readings or not? I'd absolutely love to hear that. So yeah, thanks so much for your time, and catch you in the next video. Thanks, and have a great rest of the day.